US President Donald Trump announced on Friday that no US official would participate in the G20 summit, which is being hosted by South Africa as it prepares to hand over the annual presidency to the United States. He also stated that he does not think South Africa should be a part of the G20 any longer, owing to what he described as violence against Afrikaner. And of course, we'll see how all of that pans out. The African National Congress on Sunday reacted angrily to US President Donald Trump's decision, calling the statements by the two US leaders false, labeling them as imperialist interference. We have joining us now political economist and professor at the University of Johannesburg in person of Professor Patrick Bond. Good morning, Prof.
Great to be back with you. Thanks for having me.
A pleasure. And if we're being honest, in September, you beat Donald Trump to it by asking that we give America the boot from the G20, advocating for a G19. Share with us your thoughts on that.
Yes, in fact, there's some European embassies here in South Africa that have even suggested that to some members of the T20, the think tank network, that if you actually had a vote, to vote the US off the G20 island, to vote at least while Trump is in power for the next 3.5 years, and then to move the G20, which is scheduled for Miami about a year from now, at Trump's own personal golf club. And instead to perhaps have a G19 in Mexico with Claudia Sheinbaum president. But as your viewers can see, Trump is actually beating us to it by putting this into the public sphere, that there could be a winnowing away of the G20 to make sure that the economies, the countries, the leaderships that are not constructive actually aren't part of it. Now, he thinks that's South Africa because he's got a made-up, completely fictional notion that Afrikaner farmers are under some sort of political, social, and economic pressure. In reality, the only pressure that the Afrikaner farmers that I've talked to, they're under is from Donald Trump's own tariffs that hit in August on citrus and nuts and vineyard products. So I think what we're looking at is a very clear sense that Donald Trump has left reality behind, just the way he did last week with his threats to invade Nigeria on the question of the oppression of Christians. So he's got a very clear sense that he's talking now to his own base, racists, and in some senses, the born-again Christians. And he's not actually dealing with the realities of geopolitics.
Right. And like you said, Nigeria, we have our own conversation going on. But let's focus on the G20 and his threats to boot South Africa out. You're basically saying his reasons are not founded, especially with his talk around violence against Afrikaners. But what are the possibilities of this happening? And how are member states, how are they going to play along with this, including South Africa? What's their reaction to this?
Well, the South African government on Saturday responded with a very mealy-mouthed, very obsequious statement saying that Trump isn't correct, and then the very, very sort of mild-mannered African National Congress, the co-ruling party, was more directly come from an anti-imperialist tradition. But I think the crucial problem is that not only South Africa and Nigeria, which is indeed a member of the G20 via the African Union, which in 2023 became a formal member, just the way the European Union is. And if you put the AU and probably most of the EU, with the exception of Italy, and most of the rest, with the exception of other countries, not perhaps Saudi Arabia and Argentina, where Mohammed bin Salman and Javier Milei are kind of pro-Trump, but I think all the rest of the countries in the G20 would actually reverse this vote that Trump would expect. You have to win such an argument by consensus. Obviously, Trump is just blowing smoke. But there was a time in 2014 when Barack Obama was able to kick Russia out of what was then called the G8. Now it's the G7, just after the invasion of Crimea within Ukraine. Now, those are the sorts of big geopolitical conflicts that I think we need to have. I think we need to have concerted effort to punish Donald Trump for the destruction, pulling out of the climate change summit that's beginning in Brazil today, pulling out of the World Health Organization, ending US aid, which creates massive havoc with food and emergency humanitarian aid, and also creating such an extraordinary mess with world trade and finance. To me, this means that we could now, if South Africa and other countries stood up with a straighter spine, a stronger will, actually say to the US, we should actually vote you off the G20 island. That's what many of us would like to see happen before the G20 begins, or when the heads of state meet, which is 11 days from now here in Johannesburg.
Right. Yeah, the 22nd and the 23rd of this month, the G20 Annual Leaders Summit. And I was going to ask, of course, United States has the next presidency, and they seem to already be letting known their plans. We know that the G20, as opposed to the G7, the idea is for a larger, more diverse group representing major as well as emerging economies. How do you perceive a US presidency, especially under Trump, of the G20 panning out, especially with the agenda that he seems to be pushing at the moment?
Well, of course, Donald Trump's ideology is what we could call paleo-conservative. It's isolationist, it's racist and xenophobic, it's misogynist and transphobic. It's basically the sort of paranoia of the white male feeling that they are being basically dislodged from their position of historic power. And I think the other element of this ideology in Washington is called neoconservative. That's the old George W. Bush, and to some extent Barack Obama is represented best perhaps by Marco Rubio, their Secretary of State, and by Lindsey Graham in the Senate. Now, the combination is really vicious. I mean, that's where you get the cuts, for example, to USAID, or the dramatic, sort of dropping out of the Climate Summit and World Health Organization. Those are the sort of angles that these very right-wing forces within the US are witnessing. And they've already said that the things that are being done here in South Africa, which is to say the G20 should look at the African debt, your country, our country, with $170 billion in foreign debt, and many others. Zambia, Ghana, and Ethiopia have technically gone bankrupt. But Donald Trump won't care about that. He won't care about climate or any of the public health or food security or any of the other agendas beyond just finance. And just as the last point, you're right, that in 2008, the G8 at the time, now G7, but they needed more money because they were undergoing a US-centered financial crisis. That's why they brought in the other countries into the G20. And that may well be the same situation that Trump faces within a year because of the volatility, the artificial intelligence bubble in the stock markets, and then more of the climate catastrophes that are creating such havoc in Africa, but also in the US.
And I mean, after this break, we're going to get into just a little bit further. South Africa is the only African country on the G20, what this could mean and how Africa is engaging with some of these multilateral institutions. We'll get into that briefly after this break. Stay tuned. US President Donald Trump has stated that no US official will be attending the G20 summit in a couple of 11 days specifically. And in addition to that, he is saying that he would like for South Africa to be booted out of the group. We're speaking now with political economist and professor at the University of Johannesburg in person of Professor Patrick Bond. Thank you for staying with us. Yes.
Great to be here.
Yeah, and as we have stated previously, South Africa is the only African nation on the G20, save for, well, AU, but not in the same way. You have said that the likelihood of Trump's, would I say, another threat being seen through booting South Africa off is not likely because a consensus is needed. But then also calls to question having more African nations being represented on the G20 as opposed to what Trump is pushing for. What are your thoughts around that?
Well, yes, and of course also in the United Nations Security Council, in leadership positions at the major institutions, IMF and World Bank. So these have been called for, these reforms, but nothing much has happened. And the reason is, I think, the basic problem of Western power in combination with the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. Now, Nigeria and Uganda are new partners, and there are even new members from Africa, Ethiopia and Egypt. They haven't really changed the power balance. And what I worry about is that both today in Brazil, when the G20 countries are, again, in the lead in the climate summit, with the exception of Trump, who walked out of that. But also here in Johannesburg, 11 days from now, this will be the ganging up of the rich and the middle countries against Africa. Why would I say that? Because the crucial points, which are debt and climate, the South African government is actually increasing its carbon emissions through new methane gas and new cheap electricity supplies to smelters even while we're in a major economic recession in terms of the industrial and mining and other activities. So there's a big contradiction between talking green and walking dirty from South Africa, and also hosting. There are basically agreements between the G20 major powers, and those are the United States, Brazil, Russia, India, and China, that go back, sorry, not Russia, that's called a basic, Brazil, South Africa, India, China, with Barack Obama back in 2019. I'm sorry, 2009 in Copenhagen. And those agreements are, number one, don't cut emissions to the extent necessary. Number two, don't acknowledge that you have a climate debt, a polluter pays liability. And number three, privatize the air through carbon markets. I'd add just one more thing to that, which is that unfortunately the South African government has chosen as its main committee leader for dealing with the African foreign debt a man who was our finance minister, Trevor Manuel. And he is currently the chair of Old Mutual, the biggest insurance company in Africa, and the deputy chair of Rothschilds. Both those institutions have the portfolios, including African sovereign debt. So therefore, he's in a very direct conflict of interest, where his material interests are to have high interest rates and repayment. The interests of Africa are exactly the opposite, to question odious debt, the debt from corrupt deals. South Africa has many of them, but also to get a cheaper interest rate, more subsidies, and less private sector squeezing of Africa, which we've seen really for about 10, 15 years, whether it comes from the Chinese private firms and their state banks, or the euro bond markets where many African countries were lending, or the IMF and World Bank backing up commercial banks. And I think this is the real chance to ask the question, doesn't the West, and I think the BRICS, don't they owe the African countries a climate debt payment that should cancel out the financial debt that Africa owes the West and the BRICS?
A climate debt payment. So I do recall our president at the last BRICS summit bringing that conversation up. Whether or not it will happen, we'll have to wait and see. And I also remember you've also called this is it talk left, walk right, or the other way around?
It is talk left, walk right, because you often get a third worldist critique of the West, especially from the BRICS. Then you find that the BRICS are moving up into the West's institutions. And the one example that will be very poignant for you, 2016, the West and allowed the BRICS to have a much greater share of the IMF. And China, for example, increased by 37% its holding. But what was the result? Nigeria lost 41% of its power. So the middle is sort of increasing by stepping on the heads of the poor. That's the talk left, walk right that still predominates in geopolitics.
Unfortunately. Finally, before we let you go, we are seeing, and I think I'd like to get your assessment of Africa's play with some of these multilateral institutions, the footing Africa has in some of these, multilateral institutions. What's your assessment of that? And even beyond the global ones, locally, continentally, the regional blocs, what are your thoughts on how countries in Africa and Africa as a whole is engaging these institutions?
Well, with the exception of occasional mavericks from places like Nigeria, I'm thinking of Charles Soludo, the former central banker who could stand up to the West and make very strong points. Mostly it's assimilation of Africans, and that would include from South Africa, Trevor Manuel, who, as I said, is running this African debt committee within the G20. So he was the chair of the IMF and the World Bank one year, and head of the development committee, as is currently our central bank governor of the Seko Kanyako. So that's the problem. And it's one that Frantz Fanon described quite a while ago, in which he thought that there was, unfortunately, a tendency for some of these African leaders to become the transmission belt of the West. And I can see that in so many of the countries. The only solution is what we've been seeing in places like Zambia last week, or Madagascar the week before, or Morocco a couple of weeks before that, and then Tunisia and Kenya. And that is the upsurge of anger from the new Gen Z activists who say, actually, we don't want to see more elites from our countries tapping into the West and into the BRICS. We'd rather see full questioning. And they, in Kenya, for example, demand a debt audit. They are asking, well, who really owes what to whom? And shouldn't we cancel the debt and really have for the next generations a chance at a decent life. And I hope that's the spirit that more Africans will pick up, especially if they can see in Johannesburg some very disappointing outcomes about 12 days from now when the G20 wraps up on Sunday the 23rd. And it won't really make any difference to the lives of ordinary Africans because of this adverse power balance.
Oh dear. All right. Of course, we'll be tracking all that and more at the G20 summits happening in South Africa, the 22nd and 23rd of November. But thank you so much for your time, Professor Patrick Bond, professor at the University of Johannesburg and political economist. We do appreciate it.
Thank you.